Westside, I'm thankful to have these moments we have together. And song is often the place we go when we can't figure things out, especially when it comes to God and relationship with God. Because this faith of ours is a climb, but we're not in it alone. The beautiful thing about our God is Jesus came down from the mount and met us at the lowest point. And know this today as we sing that He finds us in wherever we're at.
Oh, how high would I climb mountains if the mountains were where you hide? Oh, how far I'd scale the valleys if you grace the other side. Oh, how long have I chased rivers from lowly seas to where they rise, against the rush of grace descending from the source of its supply. 'Cause in the highlands and the heartache, you're neither more nor less inclined. I would search and stop at nothing. You're just not that hard to find. I will praise you on the mountain. I will praise you when the mountain's in my way. You're the summit where my feet are. So I will praise you in the valleys all the same. No less God within the shadow, no less faithful when the night leads me astray. You're the heaven where my heart is. In the highlands and the heartache all the same. Oh, how far beneath your glory does your kindness extend the path, from where your feet rest on the sunrise to where you sweep the sinner's past. And oh, how fast would you come running if just to shadow me through the night, trace my steps through all my failures and walk me out the other side. For who could dare ascend that mountain, the valleyed hill called Calvary, before the one I call Good Shepherd, who like a lamb was slain for me? I will praise you on the mountain. I will praise you when the mountain's in my way. You're the summit where my feet are. So I will praise you in the valleys all the same. No less God within the shadow, no less faithful when the night leads me astray. You're the heaven where my heart is. In the highlands and the heartache all the same.
And whatever I walk through, wherever I am, your name can move mountains wherever I stand. And if ever I walk through the valley of death, I'll sing through the shadows my song of ascent.
Whatever I walk through, wherever I am, your name can move mountains wherever I stand. And if ever I walk through the valley of death, I'll sing through the shadows my song of ascent, my song of ascent. Oh. From the gravest of all valleys come the pastures we call grace, a mighty river flowing upwards from a deep but empty grave. You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and more of His rule. You're blessed when you feel you've lost what is most dear to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one most dear to you.
You're blessed when you've worked up a good appetite for God. He's food and drink and the best meal you'll ever eat. And you're blessed when you care. At the moment of being full of care, you find yourselves cared for.
You're blessed when you get your inside world, your heart and mind put right. Then you can see God in the outside world.
Hold me now in the hands that created the heavens. Find me now where the grace runs as deep as your scars. You pulled me from the clay. You set me on a rock. You called me by your name. Made my heart whole again. Lifted up, and my knees know it's all for your glory. I might stand with more reasons to sing than to fear. You pulled me from the clay. You set me on a rock. You called me by your name. Made my heart whole again. lend ourselves and our heart to anything in the world. The only thing we know that offers the security we all long for is trusting our heart to the one who created it. So today we trust you, God, with our whole heart. And we thank you that you've got us. And that your grace holds us now.
Westside families, check out our free downloadable family magazine available on our website. Inside, you'll find daily devotionals, articles, and age-appropriate resources. Give it a look through at WKC.org. Also available on the homepage today is our kids and youth programs so they can enjoy their own teaching. And don't forget to subscribe on our YouTube page to ensure you don't miss out on anything new here.
Thank you again for your support to Westside. You can text 84321, go to our website and click on the Give tab, or give on the WKC Journal app as well. For any pastoral care needs you may have, we are here to help. This may include a meal, some prayer, or even a FaceTime chat. So please email care@wkc.org. And speaking of pastor, here's Bobby to say hello.
I think that life is made up of never seen that before moments. I was driving here early in 2009 in the spring, and we had some water issues because of the melt, and my job was to make sure that we did not flood our neighbors next door. And I had one of those moments, never saw that before, when a pickup truck was attached to a water skier, and they were water skiing the Westside King's Church ditch. Well, we let them run a few times, that's only fair, but then we had to stop the entertainment. Never saw that before. I had a conversation this week with our friends in Italy, and it's amazing to hear what's happening. We've partnered with them, and although COVID has slowed down the meeting space and what they're allowed to do, it's interesting that even in the early stage of soft launch, they've reached 65 people as a soft launch start. It's amazing because the church that we're working with has been around for many years, and they're maxed out at 300 people, which is a large church in Italy. So we're excited to see what God is doing there, and what an encouragement that I needed to take hold of this week, to be reminded that in the middle of devastation and challenge and limitation, that the message of hope, faith is being lifted, and people are gearing up even in the middle of challenge, because we're going to have another story to the gospel and the work of Christ that says, I never have seen that before.
Well, hello again. We're beginning a new season of our series called Doubt, a Faith with Space to be Unsure. And we're beginning this new season of this series. And, well, it's probably important to say that we plan our teaching year ahead at Westside. So back last summer when we were shaping out this year, I think it's pretty obvious to say we had no idea what things were going to look like when we started teaching the second series of this particular series that we're part of. But however, despite the fact it's what we planned, let's just go out on a limb for a second and say our current situation that we're living in might just be generating some feelings of doubt and fear and uncertainty in some of us. I mean, and the thing about that is when we live in a place of doubt and uncertainty and fear, this starts to have a disturbing effect on our faith. And we start to worry a little bit about what do we do with our faith when we're feeling uncertain and when perhaps God isn't acting the way that we had expected him to. We find ourselves feeling like we're a little bit shaken. And what often happens in that sort of context is we start to become anxious about our faith, because often we've been sort of taught that anxiety and uncertainty and doubt are really not supposed to be part of the Christian experience. And so what happens is we find ourselves conflicted and uncertain. So now, this series that we're teaching now builds on the work that we did last year on this particular series. And actually, in the description to this service this morning, you can actually go back and watch last season of this, so you can kind of catch up. And that's probably going to help you because it's going to give you a little bit of the sort of philosophical thought processes that are going on that are driving us into the conversations that we're having in season 2 of this series called Doubt. We're not trying in this series to do this thing where we're talking about doubt by defending the faith. Rather more, we want to kind of figure out a little bit about what is it that makes us so uncomfortable to live with uncertainty and doubt. And also, at some level, we want to respond to this notion, this false notion that faith and doubt are opposites that cannot sit together. And rather, we want to say that as Christians, it's inevitable that we have times of uncertainty and doubt in our lives. And some of those things are inevitable because of how we think and how we process our thinking in the contemporary world. And some of them, it's just because it's faith and it requires something of us that sometimes is difficult. And so what we want to do is begin this series this year in a very obvious place, in the shadow of Easter. We've just got past Resurrection Sunday, and now we find ourselves asking, well, the kind of questions about what that might mean. And what's fascinating is in the biblical story, it sort of leans into the doubt and uncertainty around Jesus and his resurrection. In fact, almost all of the resurrection appearances of Jesus in some way deal with the doubt and uncertainty of the people that are involved. The disciples, they don't, when they hear that Jesus has been raised from the dead, the disciples aren't like, wow, that's amazing, Jesus is back. We were just hanging out waiting for him and we knew he was about to come along soon enough anyway. Actually, the opposite. The disciples who spent all of their time with Jesus, their primary response to hearing that Jesus has been raised from the dead is one of doubt, is one of disbelief. In fact, some of the disciples, even facing him, there's a little uncertainty. And that, for me, is hugely helpful for us in the contemporary context because we then can read the resurrection stories of Jesus and we can read them as a model for us to navigate our own anxieties around doubt and uncertainty. So to do that, I want us to jump into a particular biblical text this morning. It's a text that's set in Luke chapter 24, and the text is set on the resurrection day. The text begins on the very day that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and it focuses around two disciples that don't yet know that Jesus has been raised from the dead. The text begins in Luke chapter 24 and verse 13 like this. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. So let's just pause right there in this story, and we're going to read our way slowly through this story today, but let's just pause right at the very start and ask this question. What do you do when the wheels fall off? When your wagon's wheels get a little loose and all of a sudden they start kind of, falling off on you, how do you respond? You've been living out a particular story. You've been in a particular channel and way of thinking about life, and it's all of a sudden become apparent that that's not apparently working out for you. These disciples have been following Jesus and they'd hoped all these things about what he was going to be, and then Jesus gets crucified. And now, therefore, it's very evident that Jesus' story is not working out the way that everybody had imagined it would. When our story crashes down around about us, when our plans and our hopes and our understanding of how things were going to go no longer go that way, how do we respond? What do you do when you're in the middle of a situation, and many of us can relate to this at this exact moment in history, where it feels like midway through the plot of your life, somebody fired the director and brought in somebody else. And you've gone from what you hoped was some sort of kind of light-hearted romantic comedy that you were part of, that all of a sudden the film of your life has become like a tragedy or a horror story or something like that. And it all happened really quickly, and everything has just crashed down round about you. Your way of life, your hopes, your beliefs, they're all in rubble. Like if you were to insert yourself into this story today, if you inserted yourself in and imagined you were one of these two disciples, we know from reading elsewhere their names are Cleopas and Mary. If you were to insert yourself into their story, how would you feel? I'd love to hear how you felt about that. In fact, maybe as you're watching just now in the comments below, you could leave a word or two words to say, hey, if this was me, this is how I'd feel. If I was one of Jesus' first disciples and now was in this situation where he died and it seemed like the end of the story, what emotions would you be feeling? Write them in the comments and give us an idea of how you're navigating your own place in this story. Is it grief or fear? Is it anger or loss? Is it loneliness? Is it disappointment? They're walking this 7-mile journey from Jerusalem and talking with each other about what had happened. And something has happened here. Something that has threatened the parameters of their life. Something that has required something from them that they weren't ready to give. And you can relate to this because it happens to all of us. You're living out a particular life story and your faith is built on a particular concept or sequence of concepts, and then something changes and it looks like that's no longer true. Maybe you've had that awkward conversation with a work colleague or a friend, even in the last month, where they've said, hey, I thought you believed in God, and why is this happening if what you say about God is true? And in those moments, everything can feel really fragile around you, and we become filled with doubt, and our faith feels like it's made of the kind of most dainty crystal, and just one little thing the wrong way, and it's going to smash into 1,000 pieces. And we so often live in this kind of fragilized faith. And these disciples, I don't think, are any different from us. Notice they are walking away from Jerusalem. They're getting out of town. They're getting out of Jerusalem. The whole of Luke's gospel, Luke has been telling us about how Jesus is leading everything towards Jerusalem. So when he says in this moment here that they are going from Jerusalem, I think if you're really sharp reading this gospel, you think, oh, wait a minute, these disciples are on the way out. You might call this a subtraction story. They're subtracting themselves from Jerusalem. And the reason we phrase it this way is because I think we can relate to how we do this. In fact, in our history, it's been a common response when you find a kind of conflict in your faith, when your faith hits up against something that you don't know how to answer. What we generally tend to do is what's called subtraction. We cut out the problematic stuff. We create distance between us and the bits of our faith that we don't know what to do with. The basic premise of how we think, particularly as Western thinkers or people that have grown up and been educated within Western systems, the basic premise is if you can boil down your thinking until all you're left with is stuff that you can make sense of and you can prove to be true, then that is what is truth. So faith starts out here, and then we start throwing out all the bits that we can't really just make sense of, that seem difficult or awkward or uncomfortable or leave us feeling fragile around others. And what happens is Christians get involved so often in kind of just tossing out all these aspects of our faith until what they're left with is something that they think they can hold onto. These disciples subtract themselves from this story. Let's get 7 miles from Jerusalem. Let's get out of here because this is too difficult. But as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" And they stood still, their faces downcast. So they're in the midst of this subtraction story. They're getting themselves out of the situation that's causing them problems, that's causing them faith challenges. And while they're extracting themselves, Jesus comes alongside them. And this is an important image that you don't want to miss. Like, don't miss the model of what's being said in this text for us right now. In fact, this appears in all of the post-Easter doubting stories in the New Testament. That people find themselves struggling to come to terms with what is going on, struggling to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And where does Jesus appear in those stories? He appears and presents himself to the people who are struggling. He comes alongside these disciples and he walks with them and he invites them into a discussion. I don't think we should read this as purely a story at this point. Rather, the writer is telling us something about where do you locate Jesus when you're in the midst of doubt? Where do you find Jesus when you're uncertain? Where is Jesus going to be when you feel like giving up? And the answer, it's a common answer with Jesus, but we see it again here. Jesus is in the midst of the doubt with us. So one of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. So they're in a subtraction story. They're getting themselves out of Jerusalem. Jesus comes and he walks alongside them. But what is Jesus doing here? Jesus doesn't walk into this story like some cowboy trying to return the horses back to the barn. He doesn't come up and excommunicate them, "All ye of little faith." He doesn't throw rocks at them. He doesn't gossip about them behind their back. He doesn't say, "Guys, your doubt is such that you're not in my gang anymore." In fact, it almost seems that Jesus is okay with them asking these questions and wondering about this and having this doubt, because he asks them the question, "What things?" It's as if Jesus is coming to them and saying, "What are you struggling with? What are you having an issue with? Tell me." Maybe Jesus is saying it like this: "Tell me the story from your perspective. Tell me what you think is going on." And so they do. They tell their story. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day since all of this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. And then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see Jesus. They tell their story. What things Jesus says. And they say, well, here is our story. And notice, when you begin to read this story up here, it's a faith story. We had hoped. They had messianic expectation. Jesus was going to come and liberate and rescue everything. But then our hopes crashed. We had hoped. But we're not really sure that we hope anymore. Our hopes crashed down. And what was the basis of their hopes crashing? On one level, you say, well, it's the events that went on. It's the facts of the story. Jesus was crucified. And then on another level, notice what goes on. They change the parameters of the story that they're part of. At this point up here, they're telling you that they hoped in God. They had faith and they trusted and believed that God was doing something. But then somewhere along the second half of their telling of the story, notice what takes over. The parameters change and they move from questions about faith to questions about what they can prove. We had hoped this about Jesus, but now the evidence and the proof tells us that we can't trust this story anymore. There was no evidence that the story that we've been told was right. And this is a challenge for many of us who follow Jesus in the world today. We've adopted, most people actually have accidentally adopted a worldview that fundamentally deconstructs our faith. And what I mean by that is we've kind of shrunk our faith down into this kind of tiny little convenient package that removes anything within our faith that we might call transcendent. Anything that we can't prove, anything that we can't test, anything that we can't show to be real, we assume is not true. We assume it's not real. And see, we do essentially what these two disciples do here. We might have our hopes and we might have our faith, but when it comes to the moment that we can't prove it and that we can't define the evidence for what we think, we kind of start giving up on it. And not only is this a really bad way to think about faith and a really bad way to think about following Jesus, but it's a really bad way to think about reality as well. As much as we live in a context that wants to tell us that things are only true if we can prove them, it's just not how the world works. The world is so much bigger and grander than things that we can test or see through a telescope or a microscope. The world is beyond what we can just simply feel. And if you're not sure about this, just grab a parent at random and ask them this question. What was it like the first time that you held your child? What was that like? Now, here's my bet, and we can take this one and you can tell me if I'm wrong. But when you ask a parent, what was it like the first time you held your child, they probably are not going to answer you with factual pieces of evidence. Like, I've never heard a dad say this. Well, the first time they handed me my child, I thought, wow, this baby's really gooey. Or, oh my goodness, we need to give this child a bath. Like we don't speak to the facts. Instead, what I find is that when you ask people that question, they talk about transcendent things. Not things that are factual and evidence-based, but they talk about the overwhelming nature of that moment. They talk about love, compassion. In fact, often what you hear when people talk about holding their child for the first time is they talk about awe. The world, the moment they hold this child, has become less tangible and more transcendent than we imagined. We discover the world is bigger than we thought, and there's more going on than we'd realized. They didn't see Jesus. So because we've got no evidence, maybe it's time for us to subtract ourselves and get out of this story. So how does Jesus respond to their shrinking story? He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Now, I don't know about you, I really wish Luke had said more than a sentence here. I really wish he just spent a few more chapters giving us some insight into this Bible study. It would have really, really helped a lot of us. But notice what Jesus does here. The two disciples, Cleopas and Mary, they give Jesus, here's our version of the story. We don't have the evidence and the proof, therefore it's time for us to kind of give up on this. And what does Jesus do? Well, what he does actually is beautiful here. He tells them the story again. He tells them the same story. It's a story about the Messiah. It's a story about the prophets. It's the story about expectations and hopes. It's the same story. It's their story, but it's also a different story. Because instead of working from proofs and evidence to lead them to faith, Jesus positions himself at the center of the story and uses himself to interpret everything else. In all of life's uncertainty and doubt, the biblical text always offers you one and only one hook on which everything else is going to hang, and that's Jesus. Jesus is the truth. Jesus is the way to understand things. Jesus is the interpretation in the biblical text. John actually says it in his gospel, doesn't he? He says, Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." So for the biblical writers, this is how they thought about everything. They didn't go and find out what was true and use that truth to interpret and make sense of Jesus. No, rather what the biblical writers did is they used Jesus to make sense of everything else. And if we don't let faith change the parameters of how we make sense of the world, then we're always going to struggle to make sense of anything. That would at least be the story that the Bible tells us. In fact, even Paul in 1 Corinthians in chapter 1, he says, listen, Jesus will frustrate your sense of intelligence, and you'll even feel foolish sometimes if you try and read Jesus through your own parameters. But what if Jesus turns everything upside down? What if he becomes the lens through which we make sense of everything else? What if Jesus becomes the center of all things and everything else is seen through that? What if nothing makes sense if we don't put Jesus in his right place? What if the reason that we struggle with so many doubts and the reason we have so many uncertainties is because we're trying to enforce our parameters onto an understanding of the God who made the world, when actually that God has come alongside us and he's trying to show us how to make sense of things? What if we're living out of sync? What if we're subtracting and trying to get out of Jerusalem, and therefore things just don't make sense to us anymore? As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it's nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sights. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" Were not our hearts burning, they said. We sat with Jesus, and in the moment when they sat with Jesus and let Jesus be the interpretation of their world, they saw him, and everything made sense. And now, notice, they now tell the truth. All of their proof and evidence told them that Jesus was dead. But like the parent holding the child for the first time, something was going on inside of them. Something transcendent was happening that was beyond the proof and the evidence. You see, because you can't test a burning heart. You can't test the parent's love for the child. You can't test those things in a lab or under a microscope. But that doesn't mean they're not true. Jesus was raised from the dead. And so they got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. They go back home. But they go back to Jerusalem, to where they're supposed to be, with a different perspective on the story. Emmaus is a story that happened, but it's also a story that always happens. It's a story that happened for these two disciples, for Cleopas and Mary, but it's also David's story, and it's also your story, because it asks us to think about how do we respond to doubt and uncertainty. We can respond by engaging in subtraction, and that is generally the way that our contemporary context encourages us to respond. If you're not sure about something, if you have doubt and uncertainty, subtract it. Lean into this subtraction process. Throw everything overboard that you can't prove. Of course, the problem with this approach is it leaves you on an empty boat that's still leaking. The other option we have is to try and plug the doubts with evidence. And again, Christians throughout the years, particularly in recent years, have tried to do this. Let's find evidence that proves this story is true. If only we could have seen the body of Jesus. If only we could have seen the resurrected Jesus. If we could have seen what the women had said they saw, we too could be believed. But the problem with this is, this actually puts us in the same boat. We're still, if we decide that we will only believe if we can see something, what we're saying is that the truths that we believe will prove to us Jesus, and not Jesus prove the truths to us. And how much of our doubt and uncertainty comes because we're just trying to plug the leaks. We're not actually asking the questions of our faith that our faith needs. We're not listening to a different story. We can become so obsessed with plugging the holes in our own faith, and our family's faith, and our friends' faith, that we never ask the questions as to whether we're even thinking about the story correctly. We just become obsessed with stopping the subtraction. Let's keep everybody in Jerusalem. Let's make sure no one can run away. Don't ask the questions. Just stay here. But what if there's a third option? What if there's the option that grace can find you in your uncertainty? The answer to that, which is the goal of this season of this series, the answer is yes. Grace can find you in your uncertainty. But grace doesn't come to us. It doesn't come to our doubt. Grace doesn't meet us in our doubt as a concept or as an idea. Grace comes to us as a person. Grace in Emmaus is a who. It's Jesus. And grace finds them on the road. And notice what he does. He walks with them. He hears out their subtraction story. He listens to their version of understanding of what's going on. He doesn't engage in prevention. He doesn't push them back to Jerusalem. He doesn't offer them proofs. He doesn't say, look here, look at the hands and look at my scars and recognize who I am. In fact, he comes to them unknown, so with no judgmentalism at all. He comes to them and he doesn't plug the leaks and stop them from subtracting. Instead, he walks with them and he tells the story a different way. And that to me is the story of Emmaus. It's for us to lean in and learn to hear and see the story differently. And learn that while we're learning this story differently, we're also walking with the grace and the presence of Jesus. How much of our doubt and uncertainty comes because we forget that we can just talk to Jesus? How much of our doubt comes because we lean into subtraction and not into transcendence, not into this reality that there's something more? So Emmaus is also an invitation to see the person of grace who comes beside you in your uncertainty and in your doubt. Not to condemn you or berate you or destroy you, but to tell you a better, broader, deeper story and to invite you to come back home. There is right now a whole host of things that can cause us doubt and uncertainty. And our job as Jesus followers is to learn a new story ourselves, but also to tell that new story. So if you find yourself at this particular moment struggling and overwhelmed with doubt and uncertainty, reach out to us. Reach out through our app or our website, through our social media, if we can help. We'll be online in all these different sort of contexts, and we would love to just be here to offer you a different story, to offer you ears who would tell you something new. But let me also pray this one thing over you. As I invite you to reach out and be in touch with us, I also want to say this prayer. May you find the person of grace himself alongside you. And may you hear that Jesus. May you listen to that Jesus and realize that he's telling you a different story, a story of faith that can live with your doubt and uncertainty, but a story of faith that can reshape and remold you and how you see things, and also a story that will lead you home. And may the grace of Jesus and his peace be with you. Amen.
Sky's been there, dance within your breath. Time runs its race within your hand. My mind runs wild to comprehend. No mind on earth could understand. Your ways are higher, your thoughts are wilder. Love came like madness, poured out in blood-washed romance. It makes no sense, but this is grace. I know you're with me in this place, here now. All I know is I know that you are here now. Still my heart, let your voice be all I hear now. Spirit, breathe like the wind, come have your way. 'Cause I know you're in this your voice be all I hear now. Fix my eyes on the things that I can't see now. Spirit, breathe like the wind, come have your way. 'Cause I know that you are here now. Heart and soul, gotta know that you are here now. Fix my eyes on the things that I can't see now. And all I see is the glory of your name. 'Cause I know that you are here now. Still my heart, let your voice be all I hear now. Fix my eyes on the things that I can't see now. Spirit, breathe like the wind, come have your way. 'Cause I know that you are here now. Still my heart, let your voice be all I hear now. Fix my eyes on the things that I can't see now. Spirit, breathe like the wind, come